I will speak about a large-scale exhibition that I did. Actually, I pitched to win the contest in 2012. The show took place this summer in Switzerland, in Bienne, 2014. And it's quite interesting to see the time of production that it takes, actually, from the moment you basically get appointed to the moment that you're going to realize the show. And it's also quite interesting to see what happened to performance art during those 2 years. I think in 2012, performance was still at a normal state, and in the meantime, there's an incredible frenzy that was created around performance, especially performance within institutional settings, within the White Cube. I don't know who of you went to see the Xavier Leroy retrospective at PS1, but I think it's a really interesting show to have seen, because you can look at pictures, but I think it's quite difficult to grasp what it is about if you haven't seen it with your own eyes. So I guess performance is one ingredient of that project, Le Mouvement Performing the City. The other one is obviously the city, public space, and that links it to another project that I'm working on. It's this La Otra Baño that I will realize next year in September in Bogota, Colombia. And it's also interesting to work on two different continents, in two different cities that couldn't be more different, I guess. Biel with its 55,000 inhabitants, although it's the city with the most ethnic groups and the most nations represented in one city. I think there are something like over 120 nations represented in a city of 55,000 inhabitants. It's also a city with quite a bit of problems, like compared to other Swiss cities, I guess, where everything is almost antiseptic and without any problems in public life. But they have a lot of drug users, they have a high police presence, and since 20 years actually, they have an article that gives police officers the right to send someone away from public space. So it's a very special treatment of public space. I think that came initially from the United States, that actually you can ask users within public space to leave the grounds, because, and actually what is remarkable is that it's in the interpretation of every single police officer what is an interruption of public order, more or less, or what not. So actually there's no judge, there's no apparatus of several people, maybe of different capacities and competencies, but it's rather one single police officer who can take a decision. What you see here are the posters for this exhibition, Le Mouvement. Actually there were 3 movements. The first one on the left you see was called Sculptures on the Move, the one in the middle Performing the City, and the third one with this green color, The City Performed. So it was a whole setting of different movements, and that has several reasons, and I'm going to try to explain you those reasons and to show you a little bit more the curatorial approach and basically how we tried to solve the problem of doing an exhibition, an open-air exhibition in a Swiss town within public art, by using artists or by using artworks to bring something special or something extraordinary to a city. If we go back, it's one of the oldest formats for modern art in Switzerland. It was founded in 1954. What you see here is the cover of the catalog of the very first edition. It was, strange ways, a teacher who founded the Swiss Sculpture Exhibition, and it came together with the inauguration of a new schoolhouse that was very beautiful, with a huge park around it, and he decided to invite artists to bring sculpture to Switzerland. If we think of post-war Europe, of course, the exhibition of reference that everybody knows is Documenta. And Documenta has been found in Germany, in Kassel. And of course, we all know the history of World War II and what happened there, and how much Documenta actually has to do with the re-establishment of modern art in Germany, because after the Nazi years, actually, all of them had to flee. All museums were cleaned out of modernistic art, and it was a whole rehabilitation process that was going on, and that was part of Documenta. So in the first Documenta, that was a little bit later, but also in the 50s, you had artists, for example, as Otto Dix, who was quite famous internationally, but who hadn't shown for many, many years in Germany. In Switzerland, the problem is a bit different. What you see here is the city center of Zurich during World War II, probably in 1940. And it's quite surprising to see agriculture in the city center. So Zurich is the biggest city in Switzerland. It has now about 1 million inhabitants. And what was really strange is that actually to demonstrate the independence of Switzerland, which is quite a small country, they obliged to use every green surface in the city to plant potatoes and corn and other stuff, actually, to secure the independence of Switzerland and to make sure that we could eat our own bread and potatoes and so on. I mean, of course, it's a form of propaganda also. And you can imagine what climate that would bring, and how far it was actually to use bronze to cast a public artwork back in the days. And so this very first Swiss sculpture exhibition was a lot not about re-establish modern art, because modern art had never disappeared from the Swiss art scene, but was much more about stating that it was important to spend money for art. So what you see here is the not so attractive webpage of the Swiss sculpture exhibition, but it shows you all the editions, and it gives you in these small pictures a little bit an idea of all those editions. What is quite interesting is that, with the exception of the 2009 edition, it's all about material statement. So it's all about sculpture, by bringing material, by doing by finding or placing an object in public space, and opening up a dialogue about public space by placing objects in public space. So there are different changes. Maybe you recognize Roman Signer, quite famous artist. The edition of 2000, there was an exploding waste basket that every so-and-so minute would kind of explode and display all its content on the street. And this was the last edition in 2009, called Utopics. For me, it was quite interesting to see those two editions. The one of 2000 that was called Extra. The subject was, how many layers of reality can you graft onto reality before it collapses? I think a very typical discourse for the late 90s. Actually, all the artists who grew big in the second half of the 90s, I don't know how familiar you are with what happened in the mid-90s, but in my memories, it was quite an explosion all of a sudden of artists, contemporary artists. I remember, for example, 1996, when Douglas Gordon won the Turner Prize. Before, the Turner Prize was something that was quite British, and all of a sudden there was a sponsor, Channel 4, a TV station would broadcast the award ceremony, and it was in all media, and Douglas Gordon was a very important exponent of that young generation. 2009, they waited 9 years in between, and 2009, the edition was called Utopics, and was all about the founding of utopian states, mostly by artists. And so actually this claim of artists of having their own state, having their own currency, having their own political system, and so on. It was also organized that they showed sculptures or installations in the streets of Biel. So to summarize, of course it has a long tradition, and it's quite remarkable what happened during all those years. Actually, from the beginning, from 1954 to 2014, it was at once the 60th anniversary of the Swiss Sculpture Exhibition, and If we look back at artworks that was shown back in the days, in this very first edition of 1954, there are two great artworks that are both related to movement. The one on the left by Karl Burkhardt, and it's called The Dancer. So a small figure, actually in an ecstatic movement, cast in bronze. And on the right-hand side, we have the famous Swiss constructivist artist Max Bill with Rhythm in Space. So actually you have those two poles in 1954. Interestingly, both have to do with movement, with physical movement, probably also to a certain extent with bodily expression, I mean with the dancer, but certainly also with Rhythm in Space. So actually, what is remarkable with the Swiss sculpture exhibition is that they always try to go further and to break in frontiers. Actually, to bring in the abstraction in this edition of 1954 was quite a step. If you look at an artwork from 2009 from Utopics, this is an artwork by Lang Baumann. So the artwork is actually those two doors and the stairs. They are quite high. It's a high rise in the city of Biel. So they're about on the 14th floor. And it looks like this vertiginous offer to step from one floor to the next. And everything looks way too fragile and too dangerous to be used. I mean, of course, we know all the codes and regulations that there are around buildings and public access. And it seems to be like a daydream or a fiction or a kind of utopia. So another example of how you can place an object and bring in thoughts or bring a certain perception around an object. I mean, there are a lot of other exhibitions in Europe. Kulturprojekt de Münster is very famous, that takes place every 10 years and was curated by Kaspar Koenig this past years. So for me it was interesting to analyze, and actually I invited to pitch together with me Chris Sharp, who's an American curator based in Mexico City. So we did the whole project together. And in all our discussions, it was quite clear that in many public art shows you find what Lucy Lippert called flop art. The artworks seem to be fallen from the sky. There seemed to be no real connection between the place. There's no emplacement. It's maybe an embellishment of the city that would work in the 50s, but today just doesn't make sense. So for us it was very important to find a way to pick objects or to pick situations or to pick actually a quality of perception that would help the passers-by but also the public to identify with what would happen in their city, what would happen in front of their eyes, and that would hopefully change the perception of the city for good. So even if you actually take the artworks away, and I think that's probably one way to measure the success of public sculpture, or of sculpture in public spaces, can you really change the perception of the city, of your city, even when the artwork is gone? Can you look at the city in a different way? So another thing that seemed to be obvious and that is very 21st century is that it's not only the three-dimensional space that you have to compete with and all the marketing measures that are taking place in public space, all the duck races. For example, during our show there was a duck race, which was a fundraiser with little plastic ducks that they would sell for $10. There's a multiple use of public space today. It's very easy to obtain a permit. Actually, a public space seems to be constantly occupied by some activities. It seems to be almost as democratic systems would be afraid to have a void, to leave this emptiness, and actually maybe to provoke some action or reaction by the citizens. But on the other hand, of course, it's all about the smartphones and about how you can surf the internet in all positions. And maybe it happened to you that you bumped into someone while surfing the internet in public space. But it's quite common that people check the text messages and email not only while driving a car, but also while walking in the street. So another problem that we faced is that contemporary art is much more present. I think in the 50s you had maybe every now and then an article or a way to be confronted with contemporary art, while today in media society, and especially through the internet and also like social media, especially Instagram is the picture-driven media of the moment. You have so much art floating around your face and around your mind that you really ask yourself, do you need another artwork in the street to play with, and why should it be there, and why should it occupy public space while public space can be used maybe for other self-controlled activities. During that time, another thing happened that was quite interesting is this whole Occupy movement, that all of a sudden, despite the fact that social media would be so important, that people actually went with their physical bodies to claim their rights or to bring up certain issues to awareness and into the public mind. So I think it was very interesting. On the other hand, what we thought was a problem is that all these Occupy movements have a narrative to a certain extent. But actually after some time, it was during the same time there were all the protests in Istanbul on the Taksim Square. And maybe you heard of Erdem Günditz, which is quite a special character because on one hand he is a performance artist, so he used his body as an artist. For example, one of his performances is that he throws his body against the wall of the gallery as many times as he can get up and do it again forever and ever and ever. This kind of endurance but also pain-inflicted performances and movements, but within the art context. And he got world famous as the standing man. Actually did nothing else but standing actually in a square, and at the moment where there was so much violence in the air that the act of standing won a certain subversive quality and triggered actually discussions and awareness, and he turned into one of the symbols of this occupation of this central square in Istanbul. So basically we found ourselves with a bunch of questions like what defines public space today, maybe even more radical, does public space longer exist? Do the actions define public space that take place therein? What is allowed to happen? How much regulation is there? Is it performed or juridically circumscribed? Is it dynamic or static? To whom does it belong? Does it belong to anyone? And with the privatization and monetization of every aspect of urban space, can public space still be said to exist? So on a theoretical level, the most important text actually that we were dealing with was probably Rosalind Deutsch's Agoraphobia, where she stresses the importance of conflicts and of possible conflicts in public space. The means of confrontation that are non-regulated and where it's also unclear how those confrontations will end up and how far the conflict will go. On the other hand, she refers to Claude Lefort, the French philosopher, and about his idea of democracy as an empty space. So actually she brings in this notion of empty space, and it's very interesting that even in urbanistic discussions, for example, the Viennese urbanist Camillo Sitte analyzed the whole public life and the organization of public squares from the Roman Empire to the Italian Renaissance. And actually he also points out that the center of the square should always be empty, should always be left empty, because it's the place of the civic. And we know very well like how many squares are actually occupied by public sculptures and kind of set up a social hierarchy, but also a hierarchy of power by placing a public monument in the middle of a square. So actually what we triggered were a lot of question marks, and this is a beautiful photograph of Czech artist Julius Koller, where he states his question marks with the bodies of kids that he has gathered, and where he questions the future, in a certain sense, the future of a coming generation, but also the open field, if you want. And I'm going to show another artwork that has been done that takes reference to that piece by Julius Koller. We ended up with this title, Le Mouvement Performing the City, and this title has actually two edges. On one hand, the movement that, of course, implicates public movement, but also political movement, actually the realization or the possibility of community, of people coming together and forming a movement and changing maybe things, getting out of a static position into a dynamic state, and also changing actually the individual body into a public body that is in movement and that can claim something in a different way and with a different presence. But on the other hand, we were also very much interested in what Giorgio Agamben said, the Italian philosopher on movement. He defines it as the impossibility and the imperfection of every politics, that it always leaves a residue, and actually for him it's the movement is that which, if it is as if it wasn't, it lacks itself, and if it isn't, is as if it was, it exceeds itself. What we thought was interesting was actually to open this field of experimentation and of confrontation, and eventually to try to establish a contemporary art show in public space that could also trigger a social moment where something could happen and where the city could be perceived in a different way. So in this search for a more dynamic form of public art, we thought of performance. What we were interested in is that on one hand there was a certain equal state of affairs, because a passerby is actually a body moving in public space, while a certain type of performance could be seen almost as equal. So we, from the beginning, we were very much interested in those performers who wouldn't need any costumes, any props, or any stage-like elements, but who would rather stay on firm ground, share the same grounds as passerbys, and just use this public space as an open space for their statements. So what we also hoped is actually that those confrontations would be more complex, because there would be the feedback of the performer, but also the feedback of the passerby. I mean, even maybe the most common reaction to walk away can turn into a form of performance, actually of turning yourself away and finding a certain pace, a certain way, because you exit a situation and it's a decision that you have taken, and you express actually this negation of this situation through a physical act of movement. So eventually we proposed an open-air exhibition that replaced sculpture by live performers acting directly in and testing the boundaries of urban space. If we think of the other part of the title, the subtitle, Performing the City, we deliberately renounced to use the term public space, because we think it's highly problematic, and we actually didn't find a way to prove that there is still public space. We rather wanted to use this term of city. City on one hand goes back to civis, the citizen, but on the other hand is also widely used within all kind of contexts. It's a very utilitarian expression, I guess, or a very utilitarian term that is used in combination also with other words. The most interesting one for us is probably city marketing. And of course, the city of Biel gave also money to this project, and we were listed in the section under leisure on the city's webpage. And so obviously they had also some hopes that they could make their city more attractive by getting some art in the streets. So this term of city, but also this term of performance that could refer on one hand to performance art, but also maybe to the 21st century as the high performance century, where we all turn into single performers, and at all times of the day we have to perform. And I think social media, the connection between social media and performance art is a very interesting subject. I think it will go too far to speak about that today, but it is obvious that performance art and the social media driven society of the early 21st century has a very strong connection and mutual interests. This is a remake by Thai artist Gregory Volk. He's very famous for his curry cooking. He did this very important piece Untitled in 1992, where 303 gallery. He cooked curry for the crowd, and he did this beautiful reenactment of Julius Koller. But as you can see, we are not on a lawn, we are not within nature, but we are on the city square in Vienna behind the Stephansdom, and the question mark is formed by adult bodies and within what we maybe would call urban space or like an urban surrounding. And so this image turned pretty much into what we were thinking about, like to question public space by the infiltration of human bodies, but in their civic function, actually as citizens or as performer citizens. Another example of an artwork that was quite inspiring by Alexandra Pirici. She's this Romanian artist. Maybe you've seen her work in the Romanian pavilion at the last Venice Biennial, where she restaged all kind of artworks that were successful in the history of the Venice Biennial. She restaged them by human bodies. So actually she always uses performance art to substitute objects, and in many cases also objects that are artworks. Here this performance was done in Bucharest because the Ministry of Culture cut down the budget for rehearsal spaces for performance art and dance, and instead gave that money to the renovation of public monuments, and as this one. And so Alexandra Pirici did this series of performances that was at once a political statement, because she was with the bodies of the performances duplicating those monuments, and I spoke briefly about the placement of monuments, and you see really well actually how this monument is taking away place and is defining the center of the public square. So the risk for us was, how will we win the contest by doing a sculpture exhibition where there are no sculptures at all and where everything is so ephemeral that actually nothing will last. Of course, some sculptures were bought from former editions, and the city politicians hated them for many years, but all of a sudden they started to like them. Especially it was interesting to discover that with our project. For example, during their speeches at the opening, they were only speaking about those former sculptures that are still in the city and how important they are and how much they love them. But so for us it was also kind of a statement, a curatorial statement in times where it seems to be that there is too much of everything. There are too many shows, too many artists, too many artworks, too many of everything. And for us it was really interesting. And the other show that we did together was called Under Destruction, where we investigated actually destruction of materiality of objects as an artistic expression and as a way to do art. So instead of adding more objects to the world, actually taking objects away. And it's a movement that I'm still very much interested in. So an important part to introduce the subject and to make it credible within the history of this Swiss sculpture exhibition was to build a link to the history and to build a link to those sculptures and to those metallic bodies or to these bronze sculptures that are part of the history of the Swiss sculpture exhibition. So for us, we called it the Pygmalion moment. Everybody knows from art history the dream of the artist to awake a sculpture and to make it alive. And actually we use that very much in the text as an image of a very old dream that goes back to antiquity. Actually this dream that any sculpture eventually refers to our own body and to our experience, to actually the way we experience the world is through our body. And it's very interesting that there's also a neuroscientific program now at Columbia that tries actually to measure what happens in your brain when you look, for example, at David by Michelangelo. And actually what they were able to show is that you reproduce in your brain the exact same posture as David by Michelangelo. So it's this kind, it seems to be on a neurological level, it seems to be kind of a double exposure, that you have both, you have two bodies at once. On one hand, you have the data of what you're looking at, and through the empathy actually that you have towards that sculpture, you start to get into the body of that sculpture, which is also very interesting. While when people were looking at a photograph of Michelangelo's David, that wouldn't happen, or it would be much weaker. Actually, the signal would be much weaker. So it seems to be that gradually the empathy is growing, going from a photograph to a sculpture. And actually what we try to show, the next stage would be the live performance, and that you would actually identify with the body of the live performer. So we went back to those sculptures that were still around, or to sculpture of the history of the Swiss sculpture exhibition. And you suddenly recognize the sculptures here in the back. The first movement was partly in the museum because it was impossible to stage in the streets. And actually, as we didn't want to clog the streets with more sculptures, it was more consequent also to stay within the museum, or in any case not to bring new sculpture to the public, to public grounds. So what you see here is Max Bill, Karl Burkhardt, and Ariana Reins with her co-performer performing. So what we did is we commissioned performances as Mortal Kombat. That's the title of the performance by Ariana Reins. And we asked them actually to use in a very loose way those sculptures and to override them with performance in 2014. So Mortal Kombat took place during this first movement, Sculptures on the Move. And what was really interesting is that if we look at those sculptures, I mean, if we think of the dancer as the expression of a dancing body and rhythm in space, more an abstract form to bring in rhythm, but eventually also to have movement evocated through an abstract sculpture, the performance Mortal Kombat would bring in subject lines more from the 21st century. One part was violence. In one part of the performance was actually punching the womb of Ariana Reins. And actually the whole performance brought in completely different lines and overwrote those historical sculptures. Another work that remained from a former Swiss sculpture exhibition from the year 2000 is this piece by Olivier Mosse that was also very interesting for us because it's a pedestal with an inscription, à Paul Cézanne. And actually it used to be in the gardens of the Tuileries in Paris. and it was the pedestal of sculpture by Aristide Maillol. But at some point they relocated the sculpture and they forgot the pedestal. And Olivier Mosset saw the pedestal and thought that it was actually the perfect ready-made. And so he had it replicated out of concrete as an individual artwork entitled Apple Sésame. So we asked the Italian performance artist Alex Cecchetti to start from this pedestal. We replaced it in the city center, and we asked him to stage a performance that would take place every day of the 3 months of all 3 movements, and where actually it was a performance that he staged himself for 3 days. And he asked actually people to come and to learn the performance, which was quite ambitious and difficult to learn, and then to perform it for other people and to have something like a Chinese whisper of a performance that would spread over time and over the city. So actually what we tried to do is to bring the body back. Actually the Aristide Maillol sculpture got lost at some point. It turned into an artwork, and of course we asked Olivier Mosset for permission to work with his untitled work. But eventually we brought back living bodies in connection with this pedestal, and we made them into acting body. And we thought it was also very interesting with Alex Cecchetti's performance, because it's not the artist himself that stages those performances. It's not one body, but it's more almost a tradition, a contemporary tradition that is established within the city and brought from one citizen to the other. Another thing that was quite shocking is that Biel has this blue-collar past. There was a lot of industry. Amongst other factories, there was a GM, General Motors factory in the 50s. It was the only car factory in Switzerland. But stranger ways, there was not a single public artwork or not a single monument in the whole city of Biel that would kind of remember those workers and the presence of those workers and the history of industrialization in the city of Biel. Marko Lulic is an Austrian artist based in Vienna, and he has done a couple of choreographies, very interesting, where he would actually restage monuments. One is called Circulation in Space. So actually he used the circulation in space as a gym exercise, where with his own body he started to move around this sculpture. But in another example he used a monument, a huge concrete monument that was to commemorate the victims of fascism in former Yugoslavia, and he restaged it as a dance with several bodies. So those bodies constantly try to recreate the shape of the monument, which is quite strenuous and almost impossible. And it's actually the replacement of one concrete body through several bodies that try to co-organize themselves to bring themselves into a form of a monument. So we asked him if he would be interested to work with this kind of parameters to create a monument for the workers of Biel. He picked an artwork that was established in 1975 for, I think, the 9th Swiss Sculpture Exhibition. It's around a schoolhouse in Biel, and it's called Colored Tree Ruin. And what he did eventually is to create a choreography with several dancers and to create a dance, to film it, and we screened it in the main station during the full 3 months as kind of an introduction, but again as a confrontation between a built artwork, an object, and a living body. The last example is by Christian Jankowski. He's this German artist from Berlin. He's quite famous for all his interventions. He always tries to find collaborators in all kind of ways. For example, in one case he got a magician, making him disappear and turning him into a dove. And this dove was present during the whole time of his show. he had many, many different other ideas how to kind of substitute either the creation of artworks or the creation of his persona as an artist. What he did here is there's a famous sports academy in Biel, and he went to the national coach, and he asked him to develop a gym program around public sculptures in Biel. And he published a book called Kunstturnen, so it's artistic gymnastics, but also gymnastic around art. And he published this book. This book was available in the Paragon Sports of Biel. You could grab a copy and go and make this parkour. So those were the examples of sculptures on the move, where we tried to establish this Pygmalion moment, or basically to translate this Pygmalion moment into the 21st century. The second part was entitled Performing the City. Took place in the last week of August of this year. There were in total 22 performance artists, dancers that we invited to be part of Performing the City. We kind of reduced the radius of activity to the city center, because we didn't want people to run around like crazy in the whole city looking for artists. But we were rather hoping for casual encounters. Actually, we thought it might be possible that people would just stroll around. And there's a beautiful pedestrian zone that is quite generous in the city center. And actually what we didn't want to do is like to create situations where people are waiting for the performer to show up, and after 10 minutes maybe they applaud, and it turns into kind of a street theater situation, where again there's a kind of a hierarchy between the public and the performing artist. We rather wanted to have like this kind of almost subliminal presence of performing bodies, and where like all kind of situations eventually would get under suspicion of maybe being art themselves, or you had to start to make an interpretation of a lot of other everyday situations that all of a sudden could turn into something that is near art. So maybe a couple of examples. We had artists who come more from the dance world, like Douglas Dunn, who showed a choreography that was really staged and rehearsed, and that would take place several times a day, I think 3 times a day. What you see here is part of this pedestrian zone. Douglas Dunn, I don't know if you know him, he's a very important American dancer. He first was part of Trisha Brown's company, and he also danced with Ivan Rayner and others. He's one of these Soho survivors. He still has a loft in Soho and stages actually dance shows there. It's really worth to go there once and to witness actually this kind of Soho survivor. But what is really interesting is that like his way of using the human body and the movement, the human body in movement, is probably closer to dance. What is really different and where he's really strong at is that this is not a stage, this is not a stage situation, even as open as a dance stage might be since the 60s, but this is the street, and there's no proper announcement, there's no door, there's no protective layer between the public, the passers-by, and the dancers. It's called public combat, and the aspect of combat was quite obvious. So it's a piece that is staged around also aggressivity, about competition, about physical strength, about pushing each other away, but actually the whole thing turned into a dance choreography and still something that could be watched. There is this really interesting study on the politics of choreography since the 18th century. The author is called Andrew Hewitt, and the correct title is Social Choreography, Ideology as Performance in Dance and Everyday Movement. What is interesting is that he sees a connection between the logic of dance and the structures that shape modern society. So he said this is not a metaphorical relationship, but it's more an intrinsic relationship, that basically dance is a way to rehearse choreography or to rehearse community or to rehearse actually organizational matters between several individuals. So dance for him is the space in which social possibilities are both rehearsed and performed, and he says that the choreographies of certain dance styles constitute a structuring blueprint for thinking and effecting modern social organization. Another example of an artist who's actually in between contemporary art and dance is Maria Hasabi. Maybe you've seen one of her choreographies. She has performed a lot at the Kitchen, but also at PS 122, I think it is, on the Lower East Side. What is really interesting about the pieces that she has done in these past years, what we stage here in the streets of Biel is Solo, a performance for two dancers. Herself, you see her from the back, and her co-dancer in the front. What is really interesting is that she works a lot with time and almost with stillness. So actually all her choreographies are based and on the freezing of certain postures and positions. One of the most important sources of inspirations were the sculptures of Aristide Maillol. Actually, he showed all these female bodies in these incredible poses that are highly exaggerated and just part of sculpture and art, but actually that no body, female or male, would withstand for and would be able to perform for a longer time. But that's exactly what she was doing actually in one of her performances. It's just holding those positions for a very long time until it's unbearable, and then actually a slow shift into the next sculptural constellation. So what we try to do is to provoke debates about public art and its material and immaterial performance, and to investigate a space in which social possibilities are key. So for us, it was to a certain degree also interesting to see how people would change their behavior. Actually, there was quite a bit of imitation. People started to see public space also more as their extended living room, and started actually to use it in a much more casual way over the course of the 6 days that Performing the City took place. Another example is this Austrian performance group, Willi Dorner. Actually, he's the choreographer. He's not part of the group. He teaches, it's basically a method how to implement those movements and those infiltration of the human body into the cityscape. So he did a very thorough analysis of the city's bodies, and a lot also an analysis of negative space in the city, actually negative spaces that could host one body or several bodies. I mean, this is just an example with one body, but there were, for example, others where there was an entryway that was quite high, and they would just pile up the bodies one on the other. So actually the performers had to learn also how to get into and out of that doorway, because actually there's only one way, and the top performer totally relies on the bottom performer. What was really beautiful with this performed by Willi Dorner is that it was one of the many migrant performances, and so the public was always on the run or always on the move, and was actually discovering the next intervention or actually scanning the city to find the bodies in the next constellation. And it would go a lot through courtyard situations, like these almost private settings of the city that you would never access without the leadership of this performance troupe. They all have this very colorful clothes. Actually, it's worth to Google Willy Dorner and to see like all the crazy intervention he has done. It's a very, it's called Bodies in Urban Space. It's a very successful performance that has been staged in many European cities. And I think what is really interesting is that, again, it turns the living body into a certain sculptural quality, and it seems to be almost impossible that those bodies are alive. So this is almost an inversion of the body in movement. It's a body in stillness that turns actually into a posture that seems to be almost exaggerated to be effectuated in such a precision by a human body. The craziest performance, I guess, was by a New York-based Uruguayan performer, Luciana Achuga. What was also quite interesting is to produce performance and to produce a show that consists solely by performance artists. It was much more complicated to produce. It was much more costly, actually, than a sculpture show. And because, of course, you have to pay salaries. I mean, that's also a very interesting subject, the whole economy of performance art and how it works, actually, in most cases, independently from the art market. But what was an important decision for Luciana Achugar was to bring us to the point where she was allowed to bring all her performers from New York. It's a troupe of about 10 people who work together. The performance was kind of secret, so there were no proper information what it would be about. But eventually, to summarize it, it was a kind of essential attack on the city's body by this performance group and by the individual members of the performance. There were only slow movements. It was almost like a bullish body language. They were claiming space, public space. The performance took place each day at a different hour. There were also two different types of performances. One was more kind of a free rehearsal-like performance where they would do whatever they wanted to do. The other one was trying out new ways, new modes of operation that they experienced during the rehearsal. What was quite magic is that it kind of destroyed any type of expectations and also of ideas what public performance could be. It was a use of public space like I've never seen it before, and it was actually a building up of an energy that is very difficult to describe. I think the climax of the performance was on Thursday night. On Thursday night, the shops are open until 9 p.m. in Biel, and this kind of night shopping hours is used by teenagers for dating. So actually they all dress up and the whole pedestrian zone turns into a kind of a dating scene. I mean, it's more about like dressing up and looking at each other. But there's this kind of palpable tension of this teenager group, and actually the mingling of Luciana Achugar's performer with this young crowd was unbelievable. What was really interesting is that it's a depiction and the presence of the human body that is very far from the ideal that is pronounced in media society. It's actually the photoshopped body or the perfect body. And you could also tell that this younger generation is very much under pressure from those ideals of the human body, and that they try actually to respond to those attempts and to get as near as they can with what is given, basically. On the other hand, Luciana Achugar, the total opposite, a total lack of sensibility of what public space could mean what kind of expectation could be around, and what a body ideal could be. A lot of the performers, not those two, but a lot of the performers had quite generous body shapes and were stating like a much more sculptural body ideal, a much more generous body ideal, a much more real body ideal, actually a body ideal that is closer to our own look into the mirror than to what media society is showing off with. Another beautiful performance was by Nina Bayer, a Danish artist who's based in Berlin and who's also quite successful. Maybe you've seen she's done also a fantastic piece actually that I showed in my Dogma show at Metro Pictures a couple of years ago, where she trained a dog to sleep on a Persian carpet so that the dog turns into kind of a sculpture. This work is called The Entire Work, and it consists of a retired dancer that the artist has hired that dances her full repertoire out of memory. So it's more like a sketchy act of performance where maybe she's able to perform movements that make sense for 30 seconds or a minute, and then she interrupts, she tries to remember, she has to give up on a piece, and maybe she goes on to the next piece. Of course, this dancer is not has not stage age anymore, she's retired, so it's also a lot about the vulnerability of the human body, of the aging human body, and the difference, actually, those extreme movements that were required and that are kind of, that find a reinterpretation in the context of this contemporary art show. Of course, also it's not a dance floor, it's the lawn in a small public park. So the floor is not very suitable for this type of dance movement. Another work by Argentinian, London-based artist Pablo Bronstein, who works a lot with Baroque culture. On one hand, the culture of the court, of royal courts, but also with architecture a lot. He was very much interested in the facade of this bourgeois building on the central square of Biel, and also on the human bodies, actually the figures that you can find on the facade. And he developed a performance to be performed on the balcony. You see it, actually, this third floor balcony. He brought a dancer from LA who performed in his Red Cat show, and that he appreciated very much for one reason. She was supposed to do what is called spezzatura. It's this very kind of exaggerated movements of 18th century courtois culture, where, for example, you have a specific movement to bring the cup of tea to your lips and to bring it back to the table. I mean, this whole culture of movements has found a certain imprint within ballet culture, but has been also taken into gay culture to a certain extent. And so he was very interested to state actually this type of movements in public space. This dancer has also a very masculine posture. She's very strong. So actually this whole performance turned out to be also a lot about sex and gender, and about the codification of movements. So on one hand you have this body with certain gender imprints. On the other hand, you have the movement overriding the body and the information, the identity of the body. One further example by Köppel Zaschek. They draw 3 circles on a city map, and they had 3 different groups of people working circle for a full 72 hours. 3 groups were artists, sex workers, and asylum seekers. And so actually they paid them, or we paid them, to walk those circles day and night for 72 hours. And so it was almost like a clockwork, like 3 circles that seemed to to keep each other in movement. What the artists were really interested in was, on one hand, to bring in this kind of invisible presence, because of course you would read about it, but there was also a center actually where they would all meet and where they could eat and sleep and rest. And so there was also a way to visit this group of people, to speak to them. But on the other hand, for the artists, it was a strong statement about the economical pressure that is on those groups, and that a lot of activity radius are defined by economical pressure and what you can achieve or not achieve, and that this eventually defines the radius that you will run within a certain territory. Another artist who's quite famous is Czech artist Jiří Kovanda, Kissing Through Glass, a piece that he performed a couple of times. So for 1 hour you could go and he would offer a kiss through the glass to men and women. He's very good at it because he has done it many times. I think all the other ones have done it for the first time. What was really interesting was, on one hand, of course, the public kiss, to kiss a man in public, but on the other hand also to kiss someone through a glass window. So actually a lot of the data of the kiss are lost, because the visual imprint is still very strong, but the tactile information is totally lost, because you kiss a piece of glass and it's not the same exchange, it's not the same intimacy. What comes with it's basically that you kiss a stranger in the street, but on the other hand it's this glass kiss. Another beautiful work by Germaine Kruip. She hired dervish dancers. There is this long tradition of dervish dance in the mountains of Turkey. You certainly know about that, where they wear these very specific costumes and hats, and they can dance in this perfect circle for not hours, but for like 15-20 minutes. So she hired 2 brothers who keep up this tradition, and she asked them to dance, but not in the traditional costumes, but just like in civic, normal street clothing almost. And this is in front of the main station. They would dance those circles. What was really interesting is that you don't really know what this person is doing, because this person obviously disconnects from public life, from street life, and goes into another state of mind. On the other hand, what is really beautiful is that the energy is kind of channeled, and that this chaotic, bustling street life all of a sudden gets organized by this simple performance, and the majority of people starts to create a circle around that body and creates an order that goes beyond actually this individual movement and traffic on this public square. Another New York artist, Liz Magic Laser, a performance artist, she hired a mime, and this mime did on the first day nothing else but copying movements of passers-by while the artist was taking notes. So she took notes actually of all these copy acts in order to make the whole performance more complex from the second day on. From the second day on one hand she was copying actual movements, but she was also playing like these recorded movements from previous days. So all of a sudden these kind of lost situations of body movements would came up again, but nobody would know actually but the artist and people reading the text that those movements in between were actually the man of yesterday crossing the street, or the woman from 2 days ago picking something up from the floor. This is a very simple performance by Jérôme Leuba, a Swiss artist from Geneva. He works with what he calls battlefields. It's always organizing singular bodies or many bodies in public space, and actually changing the public order through the presence of those bodies and by enacting this battlefield. So this is called battlefield number 85, Gaze,
and he hired 6 people. Those people were in the main street, so one is in front of a bank. This guy was actually arrested after the second day. What he would do is just like seeking eye contact, pretty much how we know it from, for example, I mean, there are no prostitutes in the United States, but like in Europe, it's part of street life. Or for example, drug dealers, they are looking for your eyes, actually establishing this connection that there is the possibility to open a trade. And actually, this gaze was exactly the same, but there was nothing behind it, because it was nothing else than a public performance. But interestingly, there were a lot of complaints, and the police came several times, because it really triggered the fantasy of people, what those people would stand here for and what possibly could happen. And so they tried actually to have them arrested. So we've seen this other performance by Alexandra Pirici, where she was doubling this horse and the statue of the horse. Here she reenacted a work in public space that has written art history and iconoclastic history of the 20th century. It's Richard Serra's Tilted Arc. And as we all know, it was taken away by public pressure. I mean, one of the rare examples where the public actually intervened and had a public sculpture removed successfully, because it was seen as a hazard, and also as a factor actually where people could hide, where in general just hazardous situation would be created and taking place. So what she did during the course of performing the city was to restage the Tilted Arc with 35 people, 35 human bodies, and every day they would stand in, and they would also move every so and so minutes to close down this public square. There was very little traffic on this Zentralplatz, but nevertheless there were some cars driving in, and it was actually the choice of the Tilted Arc if they wanted to open up or close down. So actually she gave a certain power to that wall, and she also took advantage of what human bodies can do and what still cannot do. Basically take decisions, and also take decision as a social body or a body of many bodies. It was interesting to see, I mean, it was quite varied, the people who took place in these Tilted Arcs. It was basically also kind of a mirror of society, of people from Switzerland, people from elsewhere. And it was really interesting to see Tilted Arc as a human sculpture. The last example of performing the city is by Chinese artist Lin Yilin. He has done street performances at a very early stage in China, actually when it was completely forbidden and where he was constantly at risk to be arrested. He did, for example, one beautiful performance with bricks, actually that he would carry piece after piece, and where he would build up a wall and then take down a brick again, bring it to the other side, and he crossed actually a whole street by moving this brick wall from one side to the other in a very laborious act. Here he did this performance called Departure from Her Feet, and her feet is actually the justice, the symbol of justice. It's a female statue. It's very common in Europe to have actually a female justice. She has a sword and her eyes are bound, and she's the symbolic, it's the symbolic and traditional iconography of justice. And in Biel, she's presented like on top of a fountain in the medieval part of the city. So he decided actually to roll, because actually this performance, or like one of his performances, is to move around in the city, not by walking, but by rolling on his side. Actually, on one hand, hurting himself to a certain extent, because you can do it easily for a couple of feet, but if you do it over a longer distance, it gets to be very strenuous. and it puts yourself also in a very vulnerable situation. And beyond that, it touches upon a taboo, the taboo to touch ground, to lay down in public space, which is actually an extreme sign of weakness or of disorder to a certain extent. So he rolled from the feet of this fountain of justice to the mayor's office. So at the very end of the performance, he rolled even up the stairs of the mayor's office and the assistant knocked on the door, and when the mayor opened the door, the performance found an end. So kind of a symbolic line that was drawn from the fountain of justice to the mayor's office, while both destinations, so the point of departure and the point of arrival, have both kind of a symbolic value, but nevertheless the symbolic value stays quite open because it's not really clear if this fountain of justice still has something to do with bringing more justice to civic life, and how much the mayor has really political power to bring justice to the city is also a question that remains unanswered. So just quickly to the third part of the show, the city performed. There was a museum show in the local art museum, quite a large exhibition, 15,000 square feet, 36 artists, and it was all about showing the roots of what we are doing, picking actually historical artworks and showing the relevance of those artworks also for contemporary times. A very famous piece, the following piece by Vito Acconci from I think 1969, where he randomly followed people in the street until they would disappear from public ground. But for example, sometimes he would follow them to the cinema and watch the entire movie, go out with them. So actually the shortest following piece is a couple of minutes, and the longest one is over 8 hours that he spent with another body. So actually he connected his body to a stranger's body, and he established a connection and kept it up as long as possible. A really interesting piece for us because it operates in public ground, but it's also this kind of bare situation where you have nothing else but just like kind of civic bodies creating a connection with each other. A Swiss artist who got quite famous as a musician, the group was Yellow. I don't know if you know their music, this proto-techno band, but he was also quite a famous performance artist in the late 60s. He walked the line in 1970. She was also part of the Documenta. He put a brass plaque in front of the Fridericianum where he stated, "I will come back in 20 years and stand on this plaque." What he did, I think it was in 1992, because he was in the 1972 Documenta of Harald Seemann. Here he just walked the line back and forth for several hours on this public square. It's the public square actually where they grew the potatoes during World War II, just what that we saw in the previous slide. But it was also interesting to bring in other issues like feminism. We had quite a bit of works, for example, value export, body configuration, a very important work, or Eva Partum, a Polish artist who we showed collages in the exhibition where she always shows and states her own naked body in public space as a feministic protest, actually, against the lack of chances for female artists and the lack of equal opportunities for both sexes. And she said she will go on with this performance until equality is a reality. But also quite unexpected work like the Austrian artist group, boy group Gelatin, with 4 members, and they've done this beautiful project in Venice at the Biennial in 2001. It's called Nella Nutella. Nutella is of course this chocolate spread, but it's also shit, and everybody knows that the water in Venice is not very clean. But on the other hand, probably everybody has this vision at some point that you could swim in these canales and that you maybe could even jump from bridges and windows, what they did. And what is really interesting is this kind of much more physical experience of the city. Normally a touristic way to look at the city is quite strenuous and tiring for the body, not very sensual. You feel not refreshed at the end of the day, while the way that they propose here to experience the city is very sensual, is completely different at many, many levels. Another work that is quite famous, we showed the film on 3 synchronized monitors, which is really interesting because you see actually what is going on. The famous piece by Tricia Brown that was photographed and filmed by Babette Mangold. It was, as it's called, Roof Piece, and it took place in Soho and Tribeca on several roofs. So actually if you look, you're going to see several dancers. There's one here, there's one over here, there's one over there. Actually, if you look further down, you're going to see more dancers. So Tricia Brown would dance, and the dancer on the next roof would try to dance the same thing, actually. Again, this kind of Chinese whisper principle, where they would try to copy a movement from one roof to the other. It's a very archaic way of communication, but also a beautiful way to erode a movement and to bring in temporality, and also to inflict a movement that goes beyond the individual body, but that moves through the cityscape. Furthermore, it was of course a portrait of New York City, of the sky space of New York City, and of all these beautiful water tanks that are located on the roofs and that are not seen. So actually the top of the city turns into a dance stage. The end of the show at the museum was Dara Friedman's dancer piece that she did in Miami. I don't know if you know it. It's a fantastic, very spectacular piece. So it's a huge projection with loud music. It's all kind of dancers, professional and non-professional, using the streets of Miami as a stage and showing actually how dance and body expression can be used as a language and how movement can be used as individual expression. So what we try to do with Le Mouvement performing the city, and I think we were successful at it, was to change the perception of the city, but to create direct encounters between art and passers-by, but also between the professional public that actually came from elsewhere to see the show. So we had actually a mix of different publics coming together. But we were also interested to bring in those metaphors of social movements, of creating a movement, of having this irrational moment of the creation of something that goes beyond the individual body and its movement. So maybe as a last statement and the end of my presentation by Jan Webert, you certainly know him, a famous Berlin-based critic, and he wrote that interesting article, Metaphors That Move the Body. And he states there that the relation between art and social reality is notoriously ambiguous precisely because it's always metaphorical. So basically, the counter-statement to that initial idea that actually we can learn through the body and that the body can turn into a kind of direct language, a language without words, a language of physicality, and a form of expression that is very direct and that affects what maybe is left from public space. Thank you very much. I'm not really an expert with New York City street laws. Probably there is. I would just try not to get caught. Nothing, as long as it's not dangerous for passers-by and so on, and you don't risk any liability issues. I would just do it and try not to get caught. I think public space is kind of over-regulated. I mean, I don't say that as a teacher of SVA. I tell you that as a private person, but I think public space is kind of over-regulated. And I've done a couple of public performances in New York, and actually the police came and one artist went to court, but there were no charges eventually. So I think the most important thing is really not to put anyone at risk, including you. I think there are many reasons why performance art grew so big these past years. But I think, as with everything, what is really important is a precise contextualization and I think a concept and an approach towards any kind of medium. I think it's not limited to performance art. It's the same thing. I think you can do shows that make sense and shows that don't make sense. And I mean, what is certainly special with performance art in the white cube is that I think there are examples of happy constellations, I think, where performances work within the white cubes, and on the other hand, there are also constellations that, to me, don't work so well. And I think the reason why performances are so big in the white cube have probably more to do with art, like with contemporary art, than the white cube. Because I think it's more a mean to express like a different art of liveness. And I think for performance art, long term, it's not very interesting to be at home in the white cube. It's kind of an extraordinary situation that can bring certain assets to the table, but I think in general it doesn't really make sense. Of course, it makes a difference if you have a contextualization through a biennial and if there's press beforehand and there are posters in the street. But on the other hand, I mean, there were also people doing performances there before, and there was like this one guy who is notoriously known for making performances, but we didn't think it would really be interesting in the context of what we were doing, so we didn't invite him. So he staged his own performance, but we never tried to do anything against him, for example. I mean, we would never have, I mean, we didn't really encourage him either, but on the other hand, for us it was really okay, because eventually it's public space, and what we tried to do is like to facilitate, to bring the idea back that you could use public space in many different ways, and also as a stage for personal expression and for like organizing different individuals in another form. And I mean, of course, there are no proofs of changes that I can track down. I can't really prove it, but I think there was a certain energy, and I think what is really interesting is that it doesn't really work like a lesson. You know, I mean, for example, with public sculpture, like those who are interested they might try to understand what it is about. But I think this question doesn't really come up with performances, because it goes down to a much more archaic form of communication. Like you witness it, and it's part of your reality from the moment you're confronted with it. And I think that's the quality that we were able to achieve. that we created situations that were that made people concerned, and that they felt being real or being part of even I mean, of course they knew that it was an art performance probably in most cases, but nevertheless I think there was not much reflection or there was not, I think the rejection came from the guts and not from like maybe a certain insecurity that they would think, okay, it's art, what is it about? What is it about? Do I understand it? Oh no, I don't know, so I don't like it. I think it was more about like the same way as you feel sympathy or not for a person that you encounter. Maybe they did, but nobody knows. I mean, there's a protocol actually that he wrote down. So part of the piece are those photographs and the protocol of the following, of each following, with the hours of the day. I'm not sure whether for following the following piece, I don't think there was any mailing for the following piece. Like he hired a photographer to take pictures of him. Probably not at all times, but he wanted to produce some photographs. I mean, there were a lot of photographs in the show of those historic pieces, because obviously photography is a great way to document. Another one is Jiří Kovanda, the Kissing Through Glass guy. He did a lot of street performances in Prague, when there was still a lot of people got observed by secret services, and so he used exactly the same type of photograph. So all the performances are documented in a way as if a spy would have followed him and taken pictures from a certain distance, like filming his taking photos of his interventions on public ground. Like one intervention would be just going up the escalator the other way around. That was just one performance. Or just standing in a square, like very simple activities. I mean, it's a bit like cutting off your own leg, because as a curator, of course, I'm relying on artists, and almost everything that I know about art, I know it from artists. I mean, I think it's much more valuable what you learn from artists for exhibition making than what you learn from books or like from other curators. And I think all the great curators actually had like gained knowledge by talking to artists and hanging out with artists. I mean, there are like also this expression artist, or like how contemporary artists are referring to historical positions and so on. I think on one hand, I think it's more about like how do I trigger as a curator directly this kind of overproduction to a certain extent, you know, like yeah. I mean, it's almost a private thing again, but I think like yeah, you just start to question yourself, you know, and like how are you able to go in depth when there are so many artists? I mean, just to keep up with the research and to look at all these art shows and to look at all these artists and to keep track of all these shows, it's like it's almost impossible. I mean, you have to track your passions basically, and thanks God that every now and then you discover like new artists or artists from a younger generation. But I think, I mean, I feel bad to say that in front of artists, you know, because like I think, on the other hand, I think it's very valuable to be an artist and also to do the formation as an artist, because I think the way artists think and also the type of education that an art school should give, I think is is valuable, and I think it's an interesting way to face society and to face questions within society. And I mean, for that reason, I don't think there are too many artists, but it's more like from a curatorial point of view, you know, that you think, so how will that work, and how will we organize also like art history in the future? How will we be able to keep all these artworks? For me, it comes more from being tired of this accumulation of material. I think I will never get tired of the accumulation of ideas, but sometimes I get tired of the accumulation of material, and like more material and bolder artworks, and yeah, that makes me tired sometimes. I think in general it's just more interesting to do shows when you cut down your focus and you try to look at the very tiny spot. And I mean, I try to describe what our tiny spot was. You know, I mean, there are like many more artists. For example, Georgia Sagri, she's a great performance artist, but she's also like this kind of performance artist activist. So she brings the whole content into game, and a content that functions almost like a narrative, you know, because there's a storyline, there's a claim, there's a slogan almost. And I mean, so we cut out a lot of things. You know, there are like tons of performances that are great performances or great performer that we could have invited, but I think it would have kind of blurred the lines. It would have, I mean, it's very simple what we did eventually. We kind of cut down and excluded, and it got simple in the end when we finished our research. It was kind of obvious that we simplified and that it made sense. But in the beginning, there's no research, you know, that you can use. You have to do first your own research and understand how things are functioning before you can start to cut down and to limit yourself. But I mean, we try to do as much research as possible, and we also try to include artists from all over the world. And I mean, we kind of found out that for the third part, I mean, it's absolutely crucial for performing the city where the location is. Because, I mean, for example, the third part of the show, this the city performed, it was very much also grouped, not so much by activities, but rather by the location and the political system that was at power when this performance took place. Because that makes a huge difference. And I mean, that was kind of the most characteristic of the second movement, the city performed, that you had just one context. And there were like artists from Bucharest and artists from China and artists from all over the world, but eventually they all performed in the city of Biel within the context of this Swiss sculpture exhibition and so on. You know, so there was a very precise context, and this context kind of neutralized to a certain extent also. It's also the whole structure of this festival almost that certainly makes a difference. I mean, the performances that we showed in the third part were like all single performances. For example, Vito Acconci, there was no public at all. Maybe he told his friends, you know, that he would do that, but that was about it. So I think this is also interesting, and that's something we could show, like how important the political system is and the contextualization, that public space is strongly dominated by the political system. And I mean, our political system was kind of jeopardized by the fact that we got money from the city, that we were officially invited, that we would get the permission. I mean, the biggest risk was the duck race, because this kind of leisure society creates so many events in public space that we had really a hard time to keep the spaces empty from like street theater, car presentation, duck races, and I start to understand that probably it's a way to keep away this kind of public movement, or this kind of possibility of people getting organized and using public space, because public space is always filled with something. There was hardly any space to get energy from this void, you know, or use this void actually. I mean, I was talking about Claude Lefort and this idea of democracy as a void. This void was always filled. Sure, if it's possible. I mean, if you like, sometimes you do projects that are maybe very complicated, or where it really helps that you have a personal relationship with an artist. That can be interesting. But I think, in general, I always react the same. I really try to listen to the artist. I think the most important thing is that the artwork is well presented, and that the artist is pleased with the conditions of the exhibition, with the communication around it, with the... I think it makes no sense to make an art show and not to respect the artist. Even if the artist maybe is very demanding, I think you have to try to understand. Or maybe you reach a point where you say, I have a hard time to keep up this professional relationship that we established, because I reach the limits of what I can do in my professional capacities. But I think in general, for example, the duck race example, of course, Tilted Arc was cancelled that day because the duck race destroyed the square. There was one large inflatable duck in the middle of the square, and it was just like, it completely destroyed the piece. And there were a couple of discussions, but for me it was clear from the first second on. I mean, it's the same thing as if an artwork is like not working properly in a museum, you have to shut it off, and you can't show an artwork if it's not presented in its intended way, because it's very disrespectful. And I think there was the same thing with this inflatable duck. I mean, we had to pay the performer, so we paid 35 people for nothing, and we had a lot of financial tension. So it wasn't easy, but there was just no way around it. So I think the institution, I mean, it's just another form of reality that can be an enabler, but that can also bring complications to the table. Because there are things that you're not allowed to do, or like even very simple things, you're not allowed to stay after 10 p.m. And some artists like to install after midnight. And so I think, for example, I had once a discussion with an artist. I wasn't so pleased with the use of certain elements in the work. It was an element that she used before. And she used it again, but in a totally different way. And for me, it was almost like weakening that symbol by reusing it. And I told her, I just feel very strongly about it, but it's your decision. And she said, oh, I want to stay overnight. And the opening was the next day. And I said, so okay, let's get organized and you're going to stay overnight. And eventually she took it away, that element, but we never talked about it anymore. And for me it would be okay, I would have supported the show the same way if she would have kept those elements in this way. But on the other hand, I wanted to share my observation, and yeah. So I think there's not like one ideal situation. Also for institutions, I mean, ideally you're in a small institution like Swiss Institute that is almost self-run, and you just have an alarm company that you have to call, so it's kind of, it's easier to accommodate a project.
Thank you, Gianni.
I will speak about a large-scale exhibition that I did. Actually, I pitched to win the contest in 2012. The show took place this summer in Switzerland, in Bienne, 2014. And it's quite interesting to see the time of production that it takes, actually, from the moment you basically get appointed to the moment that you're going to realize the show. And it's also quite interesting to see what happened to performance art during those 2 years. I think in 2012, performance was still at a normal state, and in the meantime, there's an incredible frenzy that was created around performance, especially performance within institutional settings, within the White Cube. I don't know who of you went to see the Xavier Leroy retrospective at PS1, but I think it's a really interesting show to have seen, because you can look at pictures, but I think it's quite difficult to grasp what it is about if you haven't seen it with your own eyes. So I guess performance is one ingredient of that project, Le Mouvement Performing the City. The other one is obviously the city, public space, and that links it to another project that I'm working on. It's this La Otra Baño that I will realize next year in September in Bogota, Colombia. And it's also interesting to work on two different continents, in two different cities that couldn't be more different, I guess. Biel with its 55,000 inhabitants, although it's the city with the most ethnic groups and the most nations represented in one city. I think there are something like over 120 nations represented in a city of 55,000 inhabitants. It's also a city with quite a bit of problems, like compared to other Swiss cities, I guess, where everything is almost antiseptic and without any problems in public life. But they have a lot of drug users, they have a high police presence, and since 20 years actually, they have an article that gives police officers the right to send someone away from public space. So it's a very special treatment of public space. I think that came initially from the United States, that actually you can ask users within public space to leave the grounds, because, and actually what is remarkable is that it's in the interpretation of every single police officer what is an interruption of public order, more or less, or what not. So actually there's no judge, there's no apparatus of several people, maybe of different capacities and competencies, but it's rather one single police officer who can take a decision. What you see here are the posters for this exhibition, Le Mouvement. Actually there were 3 movements. The first one on the left you see was called Sculptures on the Move, the one in the middle Performing the City, and the third one with this green color, The City Performed. So it was a whole setting of different movements, and that has several reasons, and I'm going to try to explain you those reasons and to show you a little bit more the curatorial approach and basically how we tried to solve the problem of doing an exhibition, an open-air exhibition in a Swiss town within public art, by using artists or by using artworks to bring something special, something extraordinary to a city. If we go back, it's one of the oldest formats for modern art in Switzerland. It was founded in 1954. What you see here is the cover of the catalog of the very first edition. It was, strange ways, a teacher who founded the Swiss Sculpture Exhibition, and it came together with the inauguration of a new schoolhouse that was very beautiful, with a huge park around it, and he decided to invite artists to bring sculpture to Switzerland. If we think of post-war Europe, of course, the exhibition of reference that everybody knows is Documenta. And Documenta has been found in Germany, in Kassel. And of course, we all know the history of World War II and what happened there, and how much Documenta actually has to do with the re-establishment of modern art in Germany, because after the Nazi years, actually, all of them had to flee. All museums were cleaned out of modernistic art, and it was a whole rehabilitation process that was going on, and that was part of Documenta. So in the first Documenta, that was a little bit later, but also in the 50s, you had artists, for example, as Otto Dix, who was quite famous internationally, but who hadn't shown for many. This is an artwork by Lang Baumann. So the artwork is actually those two doors and the stairs. They are quite high. It's a high rise in the city of Biel. So they're about on the 14th floor, and it looks like this vertiginous offer to step from one floor to the next, and everything looks way too fragile and too dangerous to be used. I mean, of course, we know all the codes and regulations that there are around buildings and public access, and it seems to be like a daydream or a fiction or a kind of utopia. So another example of how you can place an object and bring in thoughts or bring a certain perception around an object. I mean, there are a lot of other exhibitions in Europe. Kulturprojekt de Münster is very famous, that takes place every 10 years and was curated by Kaspar Koenig these past years. So for me, it was interesting to analyze, and actually I invited to pitch together with me Chris Sharp, who's an American curator based in Mexico City. So we did the whole project together. And in all our discussions, it was quite clear that in many public art shows, you find what Lucy Lippert called plop art. The artworks seem to be fallen from the sky. There seemed to be no real connection between the place. There's no emplacement. It's maybe an embellishment of the city that would work in the 50s, but today just doesn't make sense. So for us, it was very important to find a way to pick objects or to pick situations or to pick actually a quality of perception that would help the passers-by, but also the public, to identify with what would happen in their city, what would happen in front of their eyes, and that would hopefully change the perception of the city for good. So even if you actually take the artworks away, and I think that's probably one way to measure the success of public sculpture, or of sculpture in public spaces, can you really change the perception of the city, of your city, even when the artwork is gone? Can you look at the city in a different way? So another thing that seemed to be obvious and that is very 21st century is that it's not only the three numbers for the late 90s. Actually, all the artists who grew big in the second half of the 90s, I don't know how familiar you are with what happened in the mid-90s, but in my memories, it was quite an explosion all of a sudden of artists, contemporary artists. I remember, for example, 1996 when Douglas Gordon won the Turner Prize. Before, the Turner Prize was something that was quite British, and all of a sudden there was a sponsor, Channel 4, a TV station would broadcast the award ceremony, and it was in all media, and Douglas Gordon was a very important exponent of that young generation. 2009, they waited 9 years in between, and 2009, the edition was called Utopics, and was all about the founding of utopian states, mostly by artists. And so actually this claim of artists of having their own state, having their own currency, having their own political system and so on. It was also organized that they showed sculptures or installations in the streets of Biel. So to summarize, of course it has a long tradition, and it's quite remarkable what happened during all those years. Actually, from the beginning, from 1954 to 2014, it was at once the 60th anniversary of the Swiss Sculpture Exhibition, and if we look back at artworks that was shown back in the days, in this very first edition of 1954, there are two great artworks that are both related to movement. The one on the left by Karl Burkhardt, and it's called The Dancer. So a small figure, actually in an ecstatic movement, cast in bronze. And on the right-hand side, we have the famous Swiss constructivist artist Max Bill with Rhythm in Space. So actually you have those two poles in 1954. Interestingly, both have to do with movement, with physical movement, probably also to a certain extent with bodily expression, I mean with the dancer, but certainly also with Rhythm in Space. So actually, what is remarkable with the Swiss Sculpture exhibition is that they always try to go further and to break in frontiers. Actually, to bring in the abstraction in this edition of 1954 was quite a step. If you look at an artwork from 2009 from Utopics, many years in Germany. In Switzerland, the problem is a bit different. What you see here is the city center of Zurich during World War II, probably in 1940. And it's quite surprising to see agriculture in the city center. So Zurich is the biggest city in Switzerland. It has now about 1 million inhabitants. And what was really strange is that actually to demonstrate the independence of Switzerland, which is quite a small country, they obliged to use every green surface in the city to plant potatoes and corn and other stuff, actually, to secure the independence of Switzerland and to make sure that we could eat our own bread and potatoes and so on. I mean, of course, it's a form of propaganda also. And you can imagine what climate that would bring and how far it was actually to use bronze to cast a public artwork back in the days. And so this very first Swiss sculpture exhibition was a lot not about re-establish modern art, because modern art had never disappeared from the Swiss art scene, but was much more about stating that it was important to spend money for art. So what you see here is the not so attractive webpage of the Swiss sculpture exhibition, but it shows you all the editions, and it gives you in these small pictures a little bit an idea of all those editions. What is quite interesting is that with the exception of the 2009 edition, it's all about material statement. So it's all about sculpture by bringing material, by doing by finding or placing an object in public space and opening up a dialogue about public space by placing objects in public space. So there are different changes. Maybe you recognize Roman Signer, quite famous artist. The edition of 2000, there was an exploding waste basket that every so-and-so minute would kind of explode and display all its content on the street. And this was the last edition in 2009 called Utopics. For me, it was quite interesting to see those two editions. The one of 2000 that was called Extra. The subject was how many layers of reality can you graft onto reality before it collapses. I think a very typically scored